So this is going to be an episode that you really want to watch if you're an industrial tenant, landlord, buyer, seller, even an investor, because my guest, Annie Malo, is a lawyer based out of Boston, and she's got a fascinating story. She actually grew up in a farm in Alabama, found her way to being an associate at her firm. She's also owns a real estate development company, and she loves real estate. And you're going to see as we go through here, she brings her style of being just a big fan of real estate in general, but also her passion for law and the passion for looking after her clients' interests. We're going to dive into a few interesting topics. Such as what happens with cranes if the language isn't right, who actually owns the crane, is it the tenant, is the landlord? We also go into environmental issues, which can be a very complex topic, but she's able to break it down into very simple terms. And these types of things can save a lot of frustration if you're a company or a landlord or an investor. So I'd encourage you to just watch through this and hear how Annie looks at these issues and what she would make recommendations for if you were in that position. And halfway through this interview, actually, I should say about 5 minutes into this interview, our connection dropped and we had some camera difficulties. And I like making bloopers. If you've watched any of my other videos, I usually put bloopers about myself saying something weird or doing something weird, which is pretty common. So I wanted to have a blooper of this, but I found an even better clip where me just doing something weird again. And Annie gives an excellent explanation, which I think summarizes what type of professional she is. And I think in that short sentence at the end, it's not a blooper on her end, it's more on my end, of course. But in that short sentence, you'll get a very good overview of who Annie is. And encourage you, if you are looking for a lawyer, to reach out to Annie and see if she could be of help for you. I'll have links to connect with her in the description. But enough about that. Let's jump into the interview here. Hi, Annie. Thanks so much for joining me on the call.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
So I'm a big advocate of people using an attorney as early in the process as possible. And I've said in other videos, whether you're an industrial tenant, landlord, buyer, seller, get an attorney on your team as quickly as you can. And we're going to talk about a number of the reasons why. But from your perspective, what services and value do you offer early in the process all the way through to fruition?
I think the most important part about having an attorney on your team is that they do this process over and over and over again. I probably do 150 to 200 deals a year, and a deal being a lease or an acquisition, which means the process from the LOI through closing of a purchase or through actually getting the tenant into the property, I do with I can do from memory all the time. It gives somebody that can support you, that can remind you where you are in the process, someone that's checking in on you, making sure you've done your business diligence in the right time period, and making sure that you're supporting all of your rights within your contract, things like the right to terminate if something comes back wrong, or renegotiate if you find something during diligence. You want to make sure that you're following your timelines and you're understanding the process as it goes along, so there's no nasty surprises that pop up. So having someone on your team that is just super familiar with that, all the ins and outs, is really just invaluable.
Oh, I agree completely. And I want to talk specifically about a couple examples where if they're not done properly by having an attorney like yourself at the beginning, it can cause a lot more pain and frustration at the end. And the first one I wanted to jump into was cranes. And it's a bit business specific. Not every industrial tenant's going to need a crane, but I think it's a good example of a piece of infrastructure in the building that becomes necessary for the tenant, but can be a little bit ambiguous on who actually owns it. So traditionally, it might be the tenant goes and agrees with the landlord ahead of time that they're going to install a crane, and that might be wording specifically inserted into the lease. But if that's wording isn't done clear, there can be uncertainty on what actually happens with that crane at the end of the lease. So how do you typically see instances like that? And it can be a crane or it can be another fixture altogether. How do you typically see those worded?
Often, if it's very specific to the tenant, you'll see that the tenant does the installation. So a landlord often builds out to a certain white box condition. They give you the walls, they'll give you the MEP, the mechanical electrical plans, that sort of thing. And then the tenant comes in and does the tenant improvements. And I would typically see a crane or other major industrial equipment being tenant improvements. The tenant comes in, they decide what goes in there and they pay for it initially. Um, then at the end, depending on how built in, if it's truly built into the property, it can be considered a fixture, which becomes part of the real estate. And so in that case, you really want to make sure if the tenant wants to take that with them at the end of the lease needs to provide that they will fully disassemble it and remove it and that they'll repair it at the end. Otherwise, it can be left and become the ownership of landlord. Some landlords, that may make your building more valuable because you have this incredible piece of equipment that costs 6 figures plus that you can lease to someone else. But it can also make your property less valuable because if you want to lease to someone that doesn't need that type of equipment, now the landlord's got to remove it. And that can be a really, really expensive cost. So you want to make sure that if landlord doesn't want it, they need to remove it, they can recoup some of that cost as well from the tenant. It's just really important to know the needs and desires of both parties when you're going to be installing such large, expensive, specific equipment as to where it's going to end up at the end.
So in a perfect world, that is just agreed upon by the attorney representing the tenants and the attorney representing the landlord ahead of time. What happens in a scenario where the tenant perhaps decides that they need a crane midway through their lease and the landlord and the tenant both agree to it conceptually, but don't make an actual amendment to the lease? And I'm guessing you'd say best practice is to make an amendment to the lease. What happens if they don't and it's silent on that?
So I will say that it's rare in that instance because typically your lease says an alteration to the property of that magnitude has to be approved by the landlord anyway.
Mhm.
Um, that a tenant can't just sneak a crane into the building. It doesn't quite work that way. So an alteration of that size, of that cost, would often require landlord approval anyway. And during that approval process, even if they don't do a formal amendment, the landlord and tenant may agree that the tenant's going to remove it or not at the end. But say that we don't, for whatever reason, the tenant is allowed to put this in without notifying your landlord, then you get into a messy common law state specific issue. Has it become a fixture? If it's now part of the real estate, common law may not allow the tenant to take it. So the tenant may be out those investment costs. And that I can't really speak to more specifically because it becomes state specific. But what that really does is result in potentially a very expensive, very local lawsuit.
Yeah, and I think the whole objective of having attorneys review it is to avoid that litigation at the end, because it's far cheaper to pay somebody up front to avert those problems as opposed to getting into them. I think that also speaks to just why a standard lease agreement, and sometimes it's called a formal lease agreement or just a lease agreement, on why it can be so long. I think a lot of tenants specifically or new landlords are just surprised at how robust a standard lease agreement can be. I've seen them anywhere from 40 pages to 90 pages. And I think once people start understanding that the language required to just even address the crane in this hypothetical situation we're dealing with can be quite extensive, because the ownership requirements, if there's restoration, all those things that are being required, but there's also all the other things like insurance and all the details that go through everything. When you're typically going through a lease, what's your process to do it? Are you working off the landlord's standard lease if you're representing the tenant, or are you trying to develop something that just works for both parties?
It depends heavily on who I'm representing. So I will say that most of my landlords, particularly if they have large developments, shopping centers, that sort of thing, we have a form of lease that we have agreed to, that we have a preferred form. Usually it's one of the first things I do when we have a new development on a landlord side is we go ahead and put together a form of lease that if the tenant signs it as is, we're going to generally be happy, it's fair, and it works. If you work with large national companies, often they're going to require their own. So even though my national retail tenants are tenants, most of them will say, sorry, landlord, if you want this credit tenant, you're going to work on our paper. And so in that case, if you're representing the landlord, you have to be prepared to kind of work on a national tenant's paper. The more we do, those national tenants tend to kind of work off similar forms.
Mhm.
So I do find that I I run into national retailers where I'm representing the landlord. They're completely unrelated, but the form they're using is very, very similar. So the more you do, the more you see it. But the big companies, you'll often end up on their paper. So typically, sorry, to summarize, if you represent a landlord, best case scenario, you start with your own and your preferred form. If you're working with big, powerful tenants, you may be stuck with theirs.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think what I've seen happen a lot is on those situations where it is a big tenant or it's a big landlord or even it's just a medium-sized landlord that's stubborn, there's not often a lot of give and take on there. They can become very set in their ways on what they want to see in there. And I think it's incumbent on the tenant or the other party to at the very least still do a thorough review with their attorney, because even if they can't necessarily negotiate any changes, and they still might be able to, but even if they can't, at least having a thorough understanding of what they're signing and getting their head around the risk, because I think if people are prepared for that risk ahead of time as opposed to being surprised by it when a problem arises, I think that's pretty important to do as well.
Yeah, the most important thing that I usually run into is when I want to negotiate opposite a national tenant, where I know they kind of have the leverage, they have the power, is when you look at a provision that you want to change, I try to break it down. What are they actually trying to protect? What am I worried about for my landlord? And a lot of times they have language because we're not the first. They work with hundreds of landlords nationwide, sometimes internationally. So we're not the first with this issue. Often, if you go to them and say, hey, we understand what you're looking for. Here's your concern. This provision deals with it. But here's kind of the hole that we're afraid of. What do you have to plug that hole? And a lot of times, honestly, real estate attorneys, we all work together. We try to avoid litigation.
Mhm.
That we don't go to court for a reason. We don't like it there. And our job is literally to keep our clients out of court. So more often than not, we'll talk to each other and say, hey, here's your problem. Here's my problem. Where is the meat in the middle here where I can cover my client, but you're still getting what you need regarding flexibility? Because that's usually it. The big national tenant doesn't want to be pinned down. The landlord wants to know that they're not going to have a rogue tenant. So it's very much just working together. Leasing, I always tell my clients, you don't want a contentious negotiation if you can avoid it, because it's not like a buy and sell. Once closing happens, the buyer and seller are done. In leasing, when you sign a lease, you're basically in a 30-year relationship. You're going to be living together for a very long time. And trust me, the less you like each other at the very beginning, the longer that's going to feel. So I always tell them, we're negotiating, your next marriage. Let's try to meet in the middle and understand each other.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's some of the best advice that I've heard, and I would echo that completely. Is you're getting into a relationship that might last longer than the marriage that you're in, so you don't want to start that off on a bad foot. And having that people on your team that are all working collaboratively to see things through, I think is a much better approach as opposed to bashing heads right at the beginning. So I love it. I think that's such great advice to tenants doing that. So sorry that we cut out there as well. Technology is always fun when it works and it's painful when it doesn't work. So if that was on my end, I apologize for that. We were right in the middle about just talking about having the lease clearly agreed upon. An additional term that I've seen before, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, are a restoration clause that the landlord might insert. And it could be for the crane, it could be for anything really. I've seen it for offices being demolished. But have you seen a restoration clause specifically for a crane before?
I haven't seen one for a crane. However, a restoration clause is in almost every one of my leases. Typically, the way it works is the landlord prescribes what needs to be removed at the end of the lease, and the tenant is responsible for fixing any major issues. So I have a lot of banking clients. They have to remove ATMs. That's a big one. And you've got a giant hole in your wall. So the landlord makes them put the wall back, essentially. So they have to restore to a certain level. We typically call that white box condition so that the landlord can lease it to someone else. It's not usually as nitpicky as like having to repaint as much as just fill holes and make it move-inable for someone else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess conceivably, though, a landlord could have language in there specifically asking for a crane to be removed. And a scenario that might come up is if it's a really old crane, and maybe it's at the end of life and the tenant's only going to be in there for a few years. A landlord, I guess, could put in a clause in there that it's up to the tenant to remove the crane at their cost. And I think that that's just another great reason to ensure that if you're a tenant or a landlord, just to have an attorney reviewing that, because if you enter into a lease agreement without fully understanding the language that's in there, when the time comes to restore that and take it out, the cost could be significant. So and you've probably seen it on office spaces and all kinds of things.
Absolutely. That final bill can be a little shocking at the end of it when you realize what has to be removed and what has to be repaired. And so I always hate that. But I do occasionally have the client get a $2 or $3 million bill when they move out, not realizing that 20 years ago they agreed to remove certain things that now you wouldn't remove.
Hmm. Yeah, that'd be painful. You think you're moving into another spot and you're probably so excited to make the move, and then you get hit with a $2-3 million invoice. I can't imagine that makes for a good day.
No, no one's ever real happy when that invoice comes in. And then I get the call. What can I do about it?
Yeah, well, and I'm sure in the back of your head, you might not want to be facetious and say it, but in the back of your head, you're probably thinking, well, you could have called me before you signed the lease in the first place. But by that point, it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. Or someone like me.
Yeah.
I wasn't practicing 20 years ago, so I can't hold them responsible for that.
Yeah, no, nor was I. I wasn't in real estate 20 years ago either. But so you're right. Somebody else, the generation before us would have had to have done it.
Exactly.
I want to get your thoughts on environmental reports, and I know that this can be a very delicate situation as well, and I know that it's going to vary from lease to lease and from different market to different market on what the standards are in any given market. But just generally, however you can answer this within the scope you're comfortable. When a tenant, and I've seen the full spectrum of this, I've seen some landlords that don't require any environmental monitoring reports to be done ahead of a lease going in. And I've seen the other end of the spectrum where some landlords want a full environmental report, whether it's a phase one or even a phase two, ahead of the tenant going into the lease. And then they also want to have an environmental report done at the end of the lease to show that there is no contamination done by that tenant during their leasehold. How do you typically approach this? I guess being sensitive to the fact that like a really small lease, like if someone's leasing a 5,000 square foot building, it might not just be economical to do a phase two at the beginning, at the end, but also being sensitive to the fact that environmental contamination can be prohibitively expensive. So how do you typically navigate that situation?
The first piece to that is really understanding your tenant's business. So just because it's industrial doesn't mean that automatically you're going to have an environmental issue. There are a lot of industrial uses where that's never an issue at all. So the first piece is really knowing whether this tenant could be an environmental risk. The second piece, as the landlord, if they're operating with chemicals, if they're operating with things, hazardous substances that are regulated, you do really want that phase one at the beginning to set a standard. And that's the goal. A phase one is just an environmental assessment. They come out, they look to see what the current state of the property is. They do a historical assessment to see what it's been used for in the past, and they give you a baseline. A phase two is based on recommendations in a phase one. So there isn't automatically a phase two. You only do a phase two if the phase one says, hey, we see potential issues here and we recommend a phase two. And a phase two can cover the spectrum. It can be vapor testing, it can be groundwater testing, it can be borings, it can be anything based on what they find in the phase one. But a phase one often gives you a baseline. And I do see for tenants that are specifically using chemicals or highly regulated substances that a landlord may require after the expiration of the lease, after the tenant has moved out, that the tenant provide at tenant's cost a phase one, basically just ensuring that they get back to the same baseline they were and that the tenant hasn't made the property less valuable or damaged the property. Because typically environmental laws look to the landlord and the property owner rather than the operator. Sometimes they look to the operator, but it would fall on the landlord to still prove that the operator was the tenant. So there's a lot of liability as the property owner there. Also, phase ones, more often than not, I would say all of my industrial buying clients that are buying into and becoming landlords, they do phase ones at the acquisition. So they know their baseline going in. And that way you can establish if there are any issues that may fall on the prior owner. And there are ways in a lot of jurisdictions to get bona fide prospective purchaser rights, which say, hey, we bought it, we believed it was clean. If something happened before then, it's on the guy that owned it then. So there are a lot of rights that come into buying and becoming the landlord and getting a phase one so that you continue to know your baseline. And if your tenant base is someone that works in hazardous substances, you may get those fairly regularly just to make sure nothing bad is happening.
So I guess you could run into a situation where perhaps it's a company that operates with chemicals or something that could cause contamination, but they're a small outfit, and the landlord doesn't push them to actually get that baseline phase one environmental at the beginning, for whatever reason. Maybe the company just can't afford it, and the landlord decides to forego the risk of it just to get a tenant in there. But what happens is, like you're saying, the landlord would bear the responsibility if the tenant were to cause contamination. Does the landlord have any recourse in terms of trying to sue the tenant to get that back, or does that just become a messy, litigious event?
That is going to be state specific, so it's going to vary wildly based on the local environmental authority. But honestly, you're buying litigation at that point. It's going to be messy, regardless of what the black letter law is in the area. You're just going to end up in a mess. And if you have a tenant that can't financially afford a phase one at the beginning and they're contaminating it, you also run the risk of them not being able to clean it up and remediate it either. I mean, if that puts your tenant under, it still becomes the problem of landlord. So those, it's really important. And a phase one is expensive, but they're not ridiculous. I would say that more often than not, phase ones come in, $5,000 or $6,000. So it's phase twos can be grossly over that. So don't get me wrong, they can be very expensive. But a phase one just base ESA can really be worth the investment, especially if you have a 5 or 10 year plus tenant that's working in that area.
Yep. So one question, and I guess I'd ask you to wear your hat representing a tenant on this. You represent a tenant who's going into a space and they perhaps agree to do the phase one, which is just a baseline. They're doing a historical search on the property, but they're not actually doing any physical testing. So they agree to do that phase one and it comes back with no further recommendations. The tenants in the space for 10 years, call it. At the end of that, the landlord goes and does a phase two, and they actually do some physical testing, and it's determined that there's contamination in there. What happens in that scenario?
That you're going to have to provide for it in the lease. Essentially, what the lease is going to say is if it's caused by tenant, it's tenant's problem.
Yep.
And that's where it's going to fall. Your more powerful tenants are going to say if it's caused by tenant and you can prove that it's caused by tenant, it's my problem. Otherwise, it falls on landlord. If you have a more powerful landlord, they're going to say if landlord didn't cause it and we didn't know about it beforehand, that's tenant's risk. So you really kind of end up, unfortunately, in a bit of a power struggle there. Most of your national tenants, most of your triple net tenants, they're going to say if we cause it, we're going to fix it. If we can prove that it wasn't us, and that if they can somehow show that it's so old or historical that there's no way it was caused by them, then it's going to fall on landlord.
Yeah, and I can appreciate how it just becomes so complex and potentially messy with all those different people pointing fingers at who did it or who didn't do it. What do you typically recommend, whether you're representing the landlord or the tenant? I'm guessing you're working in the best interest of your client, so you're pushing forward for their best interest. So it probably there's probably a bit of variance between the two. But what's your typical recommendation regarding environmental clauses?
So most of my leases have a pretty significant environmental clause. It really comes down to the sensitivity of the landlord and the tenant. If it's a really clean site, the landlord may be fine. It also comes down to how familiar the landlord is with the tenant's business. And that's really where the attorneys come in, because often landlords, they own a large portfolio of properties. They don't necessarily know each of their tenants' individual businesses. So as an attorney who has worked in a lot of different areas and worked with a lot of different types of tenant, it's pretty easy to know what they're likely to use. I recently did a lease for a large beer distributor, and they call it industrial. It's industrial. They're looking for warehouse, but basically they just have a whole bunch of kegerators sitting around. Like the only thing, there's not that much. They have a lot of ice. They don't really have any, they're just mixing beer and trying different things. So they don't have a lot of hazardous substances by definition on site. So even though it's industrial, it's not really an issue for them. Or you may have somebody that works in that space, but they're leasing your space not to do that. So it's important to know what the use is going to be. If they're just going to be making offices out of it, or it's going to be storage of non-hazardous things, then it's not really that big of an issue, and you can address it in the use clause, or you can prohibit certain things from happening so that you can limit what goes on there. But really, it comes down to just knowing both sides, understanding your landlord, understanding your tenant's business, and really working together to meet in the middle where everyone's goals match. And honestly, anybody working in serious hazardous substance areas, they're going to be super familiar with it anyway, because their businesses are going to be so regulated that they're probably performing regular phase ones and maybe even regular groundwater testing and soil boring under federal regulation that has nothing to do with real estate, just in order to operate their business on a regular basis. So it shouldn't be super shocking to those parties that are really in that industry to have to fall in line.
Yeah, and you're right. I think the ones like the major companies that are at high risk of contamination, they're very organized. But I think even some of those smaller businesses can even unknowingly cause problems, like a dry cleaner. Like in my market, anyways, even a lot of the retail storefront dry cleaners don't actually do any dry cleaning in there. They just ship it out to like a warehouse in an industrial park, and then it's all done there. And that chemical, that perk that can come off there can and has. There's one property in my market that's polluted the entire block with that perk in there, and it's going to be a litigious thing for decades probably. So I think it's also important for like the small companies and the small landlords to just, like you said, talk with an attorney before you're even agreeing to anything, because from my perspective, and I own some real estate as well, I would far rather be ahead of that problem than have to try and address it when the problem arises. So I think having an attorney is early in the process is that important, because it can just save so much frustration there. I did want to, and you touched on one point. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is the use clause. So that's another area which is very carefully defined for good reasons, right? You don't want to have an auto mechanic go in there and then halfway through the lease they turn to holding dangerous chemicals. So with the use clause on how you're wording that, I want to get your thoughts on it. And then also a closely related subject would be subleasing, for landlords having the right to refuse consent not to be unreasonably withheld. What's the importance of the use clause and then the ability to control subleasing?
So a use clause is very important. One thing before we jump on, I do want to say the other thing my clients do that work in major industrial areas to deal with the environmental risks is the landlords carry environmental policies themselves.
Great point.
Just that is a very common standard in larger industrial parks and in that area, just because you're right, if there is a contamination, there can be a huge mess. And rather than fight over and try to get 500,000 from one and all these different pieces, you can dump it on an insurance company and they'll step in and clean it all up. So that's a big one, especially in certain areas. I see that a lot in New Jersey and in other industrial areas of Massachusetts. So that's also something to remember. They
Great
can help
point.
you balance that risk.
Yep.
Sorry, moving on.
No, I'm glad you added to that, because that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that in too.
So use clauses are very important, especially in industrial leasing, because you need to know specifically what's going on in your building. Because of hazardous substances, because of traffic, you want to know, are they moving trucks in? It can affect the concrete, it can affect the parking lot, it can affect wear and tear, can be more than normal wear and tear based on what the use of the building is. So those are all very important. The other reason behind a really important and carefully tailored use clause is to make sure that you're within zoning, because you don't want to accidentally have a zoning violation. Again, you can often pass that through to tenant, but in the eyes of the locality, it's the landlord's problem. All you're doing is buying a lawsuit where the landlord then has to go after the tenant. So the use clause is really, really important in that sense. The other piece of the use clause is that in a sublease or in a lease assignment, that use clause still governs. So if the use says all they can do is warehouse and store boxes, then if they sublease to someone else, that subtenant can still only warehouse and store boxes. It applies and carries on through. Same with an assignment. It doesn't expand the use. So that's one way to, if you don't have someone that really, if your use is very nominal, it's you're storing cardboard boxes, there's nothing suspect. So we don't really care if they sub out. Perhaps you have a large company, they only need half their building and they lease the other half to Amazon, who just needs storage. And you don't really care, as long as you're getting your rent, as long as they're not doing something nefarious, you know what they're doing, all they can do is store boxes. It gives you the ability to give a little bit on that sublease side because you know the use is limited. The more broad the use is, the tighter you want to be on assignment and sublease, because you can do just about anything in that space. Now you want to be a lot tighter as a landlord on who can do what in this space.
Very well said. And I love the point about just being aware of all these situations and circumstances, because anytime there is a material change, there can be consequences if somebody isn't adequately prepared for it. And I talked to an insurance guy a couple of weeks ago, and he had a similar point that anytime you're even changing over a tenant, let's say you go from a mechanic to just a storage tenant, your insurance provider is going to want to know that, just because there could be implications for it. So I think it's a powerful reminder to anybody that owns a property, is that anytime you're really doing anything that affects the use of the building, a change in the tenant, any agreement that's made between the two parties, is to talk to the lawyer, talk to the insurance provider, and it can be a very quick answer. But if you don't do that, it can be a very long problem. So I echo a lot of what you're saying on that, and on the importance of doing that. I want to wrap up with just getting a little bit more information about yourself, because we actually connected because you have a YouTube channel as well, Commercial Real Estate Law. And I'm really hoping you put some more videos on there, because you've got a lot of great insights to offer. So I'm really hoping that you grow that channel. And you're based in Boston. That's the harbor behind you. It's a beautiful view. But what's so? And I know a little bit about your story. You grew up on a farm and decided to get into real estate law. What was the trajectory to get from being on a farm to being in a office overlooking the harbor?
Oh my goodness, that is a long, curvy road. No, I grew up on a cotton farm in Alabama. My family is still there and still on the farm. But when I was a teenager, my dad and I started building rental houses. That was something he always wanted to do. It was actually on land next to the farm. So we already had the land. Luckily, it was in our family, but we designed and developed and started building rental houses. We're in a very military area, so it's a really transient place. And the very first rental house, we actually laid the foundation, we poured the gravel, we did everything. We hand built the cabinets. So I've literally done everything from studs up on a house, and I grew up with that. So it took us about 15 years to build that entire neighborhood out. And at that point, I had gone to law school and I graduated during a recession, but real estate was what I knew. And that's just an area that I fit. I already knew. My husband and I also had started real estate development during that time. We bought foreclosures and we were doing them ourselves as well. So dirt was just something I grew up around. I understood surveys and that sort of thing. So it was kind of an easy move into real estate law. Law school doesn't teach you anything about real estate law. It's very much a learn as you go, and gain as much experience as you possibly can. And so I was lucky enough to get on with a mid-size AmLaw 200 firm, and I spent a lot of time there. They worked mostly in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Southeast. After about 5 years, I married a Bostonian, and so we decided to move closer to his family. And SIOR reached out to me, and they had a position, and it's been fantastic. But SIOR has a large national retail presence. So I actually get to work nationwide as opposed to just regionally, which is really fun. And we represent a lot of large national retailers. So I do get to negotiate. I get to see both sides. I represent a lot of developers as well, from California all the way up to Vermont. And we see it all across. I do end up with all the Southeast deals just because my heart's still in Alabama, but it's just a lot of fun, and I get so much more experience. The platform we have at SIOR is just incredible. And so I love getting to work in all the different states. I love getting to hire local councils for very specific needs, and the experience that a large platform like this offers is just amazing, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying growing my practice here, and it's a lot of fun. So I get to work with small landlords. I represent a lot of franchisees as they grow their franchises from their first store and up, and then I also represent a lot of national retailers that are working with those franchisees. So it's kind of fun to get to be on both sides of it.
Yeah, and then you're combining something that you're passionate about with the real estate, with law, which is your profession. So you're in the best possible situation where you get to do something that you love, and it's tied into probably a hobby anyways. So that's really cool.
It is. We spend a lot of our time going through open houses, and now I've developed a pretty decent amount of relationships with brokers and with clients around town. So it's always fun I've got a couple out in Bedford, and I'll bike out and visit their properties while I'm out there and just pop in and say hi. So it's fun to actually get to see the dirt on the ground as well, and that's been nice here too.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'll leave a link in the description to your YouTube channel. What's another way that people can get in touch with you if they want to talk to you more about your services?
They can reach out to me at anniemalo.com. It right now it links back to my LinkedIn. We're building a website, so hopefully it won't be for long, but I'm pretty reachable at LinkedIn or the law firm website, seifarth.com. You can always get me there.
Awesome. I'll put a link to both of those in the description. And Annie, thanks so much again for jumping on the call with me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Do you mind if we redo the first part? Because I think we
That's
were
fine.
only into it for about a couple minutes, but I think just the light changed and the audio might have changed. So I just would want to sync that up just to make sure it just doesn't change too much.
No problem.
You don't mind with that? Okay, I think we could do
Yeah,
it
I'm
like
good.
5 minutes max. And I don't know where it would have cut off for you, but I was just in the middle of saying the importance of having that agreed to, in writing if a tenant were to add a crane, but to make an amendment to the lease. Did you catch that part?
Yes, I did.
So then the next part, if I just roll right into it, then you'll
Go for it.
I think that's perfect. Actually, I think that that'll give me like a natural cut. I sorry for adding that last question in there. I just when we started mentioning it, it's just I wanted to dive a little bit more into that. So sorry for throwing another one at you there.
Oh, I'm fine. I operate on a team basis. You'll hear us use it here all the time. I build my team here. I have a great team of paralegals and case assistants and staff that do a lot of the nitty-gritty here. But real estate is about a team. There's too much volume for one person to handle it. So it's all about the people that you work with. And I consider my clients and the brokers they work with and the lenders they work with, all of us are working to the same goal. We are on a team trying to get across the finish line together. And so as long as we get along and we are all working to the same goal, everybody's much happier at the end.
Yeah, that was well said. You should be writing a book. I love it. I guess such great advice.
I don't know that that's a billable hour yet, so maybe in a few years.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, that was awesome. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
Sounds good. Sorry to hear I don't know if you're a baseball fan, but I heard the Red Sox got knocked out. Sorry to hear that.
I know, and we have a Boston office that I'm in, and we have a
Yeah.
Houston office, and that has been contentious.
Oh, I bet. I bet.
Apparently now we're about to have to wear Houston gear when we volunteer at the food bank in a couple of weeks. So
Yeah.
we are Boston people. We do love our boys.
Yeah. Well, it's too bad. Well, you guys have been spoiled with sports teams for so long.
Yeah, we definitely have. We know that too.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, I'll send you a link on this when I put it out. It'll probably be in the next couple of weeks. And yeah, thanks again. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Annie.
Bye.